Hi everyone, welcome back to Regular Homies, and welcome for the first time anyone that's particularly come along today to join us for our inaugural Tech Talk. My name's Peter Lewis. I'm both the Director of Essential Media and also the Director of the Australia Institute's Centre for Responsible Technology, so kind of wearing a couple of hats today. And the purpose of today is to get a conversation going about the politics of technology and look at some of the issues that have been in the news over the last few weeks and sort of kick them around and get a bit of a deeper understanding of how technology is interacting with the world that we used to think was a fixed and concrete one. I'm really happy to be joined today by two people that know a lot about this stuff, a lot more than me. Lizzie O'Shea, who's both a lawyer with Maurice Blackburn and the Director of Digital Rights Watch, which is the premium advocacy group around technology, and Dan Stinton, who's the Managing Director of Guardian Australia, a great supporter of the Australia at Home series, but also someone who seriously has some tech chops. So I'm going to introduce both of them in a minute. Before we get cracking though, recognise that wherever we are in Australia, we are on traditional lands. I'm on the land of the Gadigal people, the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and recognise that the land that we are all on was never ceded. And I'm sure wherever you are in Australia, you join in those sentiments. I'll also, just for those, like, we don't really need to go through this, but use the chat, turn your camera on, go on gallery if you can. It gives you a sense of the room. We've got over 120 at the moment, so you see pages of people that are part of this conversation, and you can, if you see anyone you know, you can direct message them and say hello to them in the chat, or else you can just introduce yourself in the chat to everyone else and ask questions and make comments as we go. I don't really feel like today's a panel. I feel this is a conversation that Lizzie, Dan and I will start and then invite you to be part of. So before we get into the formalities, hi guys, thanks for being part of it. Lizzie, you're in lockdown Melbourne. Commiserations, I suppose, but how's things going with you? And, you know, how are you bearing up?
Yeah, I think we're doing pretty well in Melbourne. I think we're a bit cautious about the infection rates, but I'm hopeful that we'll get through it with good governance or improved policy making. And we may be the first to crest this second wave, but it might be coming to other states later. So don't be too gleeful about your liberties yet further up the eastern seaboard, because you may lose them as well. So solidarity.
And Dan, you're over in Perth, where you have been for several months. How's life with you?
Look, it's pretty much normal now. I mean, I think the big debate that we're having over here at the moment is whether we're going to have 30,000 or 60,000 people at the AFL Derby next weekend. So it's kind of another world. Although that said, I am flying back to Sydney on Sunday. So let's see how New South Wales goes. But certainly over here, it's been it's pretty much back to normal.
Yeah, great. So let's kick this off. Through this lockdown, there's been, it seems like we're in this hyper reality. Everything's moving so fast. Our world's being broken and put back together. And I think there was a bit of an assumption as we went through this process that big tech would just get stronger and stronger and more part of our lives. And what's really interesting, I think, at the moment is that there's a bit of a challenge to that going on. And the thing that's at the front of many of the debates is Facebook's role in spreading disinformation and spreading hate speech, and the pushback now that's occurring, particularly in America, with a whole bunch of big corporations withdrawing their advertising from Facebook. So over the last month, I don't know if people are aware, like there's been 80 odd companies that have answered a call that was started by an advocacy group called Colour for Change under the Stop Hate for Profit hashtag. And, you know, most times a hashtag starts, you go, oh, there's going to be, you know, maybe an email petition or something, and there'll be a little bit of activity. But Unilever's pulled out of advertising on Facebook. I think Coca-Cola, Adidas, Lego, like really big consumer brands, demanding that Facebook get their house in order when it comes to the sort of debates that go on over the platform. So I've been watching this with great interest, and I am wondering whether this is a moment where Facebook's going to change their practice, or whether it's just going to be a natural sort of moment that then they move on from. So I'm just interested, Lizzie, firstly, from your perspective, do you see this as being an effective intervention by the corporate world, or is it just a little bit of feel-good marketing?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. So part of this came out of also Twitter taking a stand against a post made by Donald Trump that was inflammatory, and then Facebook allowing that post to remain. Twitter allowed it to remain, but had a caveat on it talking about how, and it's done this on a couple of different posts from Donald Trump, talking about whether it might not be true or that in fact it's inflammatory, these kinds of things. It's starting to moderate content in a way that Facebook has taken the opposite approach and said it's not our job to do that. So part of the backlash that we've seen has come from the divergence between these two major social media platforms. And I think Facebook's insistence that it's got no responsibility for what people do on the platform is, I think, not really able to continue, because they're clearly facing a lot of blowback from a key source of their profit, which is advertising. I mean, advertising still remains the core of their business in terms of revenue, and I think that's important to remember. So it's clearly been effective in the sense that I applaud those activists who are doing this kind of work, because it is having an impact in a way that lots of other discussions that we might have around hate speech don't seem to gain traction with this company. You know, even calls to get Mark Zuckerberg to talk about it, to entertain it, even from within his own staff, had some traction, but it's really been outsiders, I think, putting this squarely to the company that has forced it to take attention, to pay attention to this issue, and targeting them where it hurts, which is their advertising model. I still remain a bit worried about it, because I still have a fundamental concern that I don't think Facebook is a company, or is an entity really as a company, that should be moderating political discussions. I don't think they're equipped to do so on one level, because they're a profit-making enterprise. And I think we do need to have a bigger question around what we use these platforms for, the fact that they're private businesses, and that maybe we need better regulations, better laws. I mean, I am a lawyer, so I like laws, but I actually think we probably do need to have a discussion about how we can have democratically made rules around how we engage with public discussion, rather than just letting a company make these decisions itself, because the company isn't accountable to the public, it's accountable to its shareholders, it's got different interests at stake. It has to head off threats of regulation at the pass. That's what it's designed to do. And I think that's part of what Mark Zuckerberg is trying to do, to get on top of this himself, so that there isn't a call for more democratic accountability over these companies, which are so central to our ideas of public participation. So I remain pleased that Facebook is being criticised in this way, and that's gaining traction, and it's clever, I think, for activists to target its business model. But I also generally remain concerned that a lot of our participation in public life is essentially being regulated by private companies, and that's something I think we ought to think about a bit more, whether that's a satisfactory situation.
Thanks, Lizzie. Dan, Guardian obviously is both, you know, it's a user of Facebook. You rely on its content, its platform to distribute your content, and you've also, you know, you boost your pieces, I imagine, from time to time. Has the boycott been something you guys have been looking at as a business?
Yeah, I mean, we've joined in a small capacity, if you like. So there's sort of two ways to look at this, as you mentioned. We both post our content to Facebook and get a really substantial proportion of our traffic from Facebook, because, you know, for a large number of people, the internet really does start with Facebook. So if we were to do what some publishers have done and actually stop posting to Facebook at all, it would have a very material impact on the traffic that we get from them, and therefore now on the commercial health of our business. So we are still doing that, just by necessity. What we have done, though, is we have joined the advertiser boycott. So we're no longer spending money globally on boosting our content on Facebook. That's also costing us, for what it's worth, because you know, we do generate a fair amount of traffic and audience and subscribers from that. But nonetheless, we still think it was important to do it. I would make one point, though, Peter. I mean, we've talked about this before, but I think at last count, I was doing some reading on this morning. I think there's over 500, as you mentioned, quite substantial large businesses that have joined this boycott. There's different reports on this, but it seems to be that that's still less than 10% of Facebook's revenue. So while this has more momentum than other boycotts we've seen from Facebook in the past, particularly around the Cambridge Analytica side of things, it's still a relatively small proportion of their revenue. And so I am skeptical, if you like, that it's actually going to have a material impact on their business. I note their share price has declined, but it's starting to recover already. So I guess let's see where this goes, I guess.
So what's interesting there is that your business model is moving more and more towards a subscriber model, but you're saying you still need Facebook to draw people to your site to transition them into subscribers, right?
Mm. Yeah. So look, the two main platforms, as I'm sure we're going to talk about, are Google and Facebook, and that's where the vast majority, almost everybody, starts their internet session with one of those two platforms. And so, you know, to use the technical language of the ACCC and their recent digital platforms inquiry report, I mean, they are unavoidable trading partners for us. And that's the point, is that we are just not in the position to be able to turn off our content from Facebook without it having a very material impact on the audiences that we can achieve online, and therefore the financial return. And so ultimately that means less investment in journalism. So it's unfortunately, it's a trade-off that we have to make.
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk when we talk about, you know, calls to boycott Facebook as consumers as well. The cost of transaction is people lose their networks. And I think likewise for businesses, they lose their network. So to go back to Lizzie's sort of broader point of actually taking political debate away from Facebook, there's a huge cost in there too, isn't there, Lizzie? And there needs to be, in my view, a bit of a transition plan about how you get from where we are to where we want to be. We started this discussion a few weeks ago, you and I, at the virtual progress. Like, should, you know, if it's a compromised platform like Facebook, should we be running politics over the platform? Or are we just creating a bigger problem? Or do we make ourselves totally ineffective if we withdraw?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think this is a conversation that we are starting to have among civil society organisations now about how we use these points of entry to the internet, as you were referring to, Dan, without letting them control us. Like, you know, I understand, I saw in the comments people talking about why I think a company shouldn't be required to regulate its content. And I wanted to give you an example of that. In June, it was reported that in response to some of this criticism, Facebook was deactivating a bunch of accounts, and it went on a deactivation spree and deactivated a bunch of skinhead accounts, which might sound rational, but in the mix of doing so, it also deactivated a bunch of pages from skinheads who are anti-racist, because of course the genre of skinhead is actually slightly more complicated than just being associated with right-wing racists or Nazism. In fact, there's a tradition of skinhead, you know, music and culture that is actually anti-racist. And that's, I guess, my point. Like, what is this company? Why do we think this company is going to do this well? I think they're going to respond in something of a knee-jerk reaction, start being heavy-handed to look good to advertisers, to woo them back, to look good to the public. And I think it can leave some of these more fundamental questions undisturbed, which is, how do we allow this choke point on the internet, this centralised window through which we access a lot of content, through which we participate in public life, through which we connect with our friends and families? How do we start to take that power away from those companies? And I think we can do our bit as civil society organisations by having good practices, by linking away, by looking at alternative models for engaging with our audience and our publics through subscriptions or through, you know, one-to-many communications like email, rather than those kinds of things. Like, there's all sorts of experiments I think we can do over time to gradually take away some of these powers from these choke points on the internet. But I think we shouldn't just assume that asking them to change their practices will necessarily fix it. I think we probably need to think about making alternative arrangements ourselves, but also regulating them better and having a public discussion about some of these deep philosophical questions as to whether you allow other views to be ventilated, whether you don't, where we draw that line. These are philosophical questions that have occupied people for generations. They're not going away. I think the way to get to a better point of improved public discussion is to be willing to have that debate in public and win people to a particular viewpoint, rather than just focusing our advocacy on the companies themselves.
So can I just go, Dan? Peter?
Yeah.
Sorry to jump in.
No.
But I think it's also worth noting, I mean, I share your views, Lizzie. I mean, Facebook is the most undemocratic sort of company in the world, and then they're charged with making these really important decisions which have fundamental impacts on society and democracy at large, I guess. But this is also a problem of scale, right? So if you look at what got Facebook into trouble to begin with, which was Trump's ridiculous, not ridiculous, kind of hurtful, hateful comment of when the looting starts, the shooting starts, and then refusing to take that down. I think it's important to just think about how hard this is, because what Facebook does a reasonably good job of is moderating child exploitation. They use machine learning on this to relatively good effect, because it is unambiguous. It is pretty easy for child exploitation to be identified and therefore taken down in a really fast way. Now, they haven't been perfect on this. Obviously, the New Zealand example again was a good example of this, but nonetheless, they are certainly better at moderating those kind of things. It's the ambiguous side of things where you get to what is hate speech that you run into trouble, because if you think about it, Trump making a comment such as he did on Twitter and then on Facebook, effectively inciting violence. Now, I think they should have taken it down, but you could easily argue that if he had have said this in a press conference, The Guardian, for example, would have reported on it. And so it's really difficult to know where the line is to draw on where these platforms should take the line. So apart from also, it needs to be more democratic, it also needs to be something where we have a more public debate around what that line is and where the platforms and these decisions are made to begin with.
If I can add just one more complicating factor as well that I think is worth keeping in mind. One of them is, so you're talking about what could, how do you deal with a post like that? As in, what's your role in regulating it, or what kind of tools are at your disposal? So, one thing Twitter did was it wouldn't let you retweet the tweet. And that's one way in which you can stop virality. So virality is something that these platforms do have some control over. But there is a bigger point here, which is Facebook's revenue model and profit model as a component of that relies on people producing content all the time, and it's largely unregulated. It's the platform's available in many different languages. There's not even content moderators in all the languages in which the platform's available. The people who do the majority of content moderation for violations of their community standards are people who are working for almost no money in deeply exploitative environments. Part of Facebook's whole business model is that most of its content will be largely unregulated, and that's how it is profitable, right? So it relies on automated tools sometimes, and then deeply exploited individuals to help with content moderation. But if we do want a moderated space on Facebook, we're asking for something that is completely different from what the business currently looks like. And, that's part of the reason why we ought to think through the implications of asking for these things. And I'm not necessarily opposed to that, but it's a different kind of thing to what we have now. And I think the point I was getting at is that I think Facebook will resist it because it is not compatible with how they currently make money.
And you see Zuckerberg using the free speech mantra sort of to back in the existing business model, almost as if the business model is a statement of principles as well. There's a number of questions in the chat just about what could regulation therefore look like, Lizzie. And I know that it really is self-regulation that the current boycott's calling for, isn't it?
Yeah, well, for example, I don't think there's any perfect model that we can look to, but if you look at something like the ABC, they have a charter, they have an independent board that's appointed, obviously, with government involvement of the day. I mean, people object to it all the time. People don't like the various components of the charter, but it's a discussion that we have, and it's a framework around which we can enter into these debates.
But the charter's also linked to government funding, where we don't have the same leverage over...
That's right. Yeah, laws have other ways of being enforced, of course, including things like penalties. I mean, there are things like the Press Council, and I saw the people in the chat lamenting the inefficiencies and the lack of teeth of the Press Council, which I'm empathetic with. I mean, there are other laws like defamation, which I don't think really cut it in this particular space, because defamation is largely a tool used by people with reputations of sufficient size to warrant damages claims that make such litigation worthwhile. So I think there's probably things we can look to, but I think probably kind of the regulation of the ABC is probably a starting point that we might wish to consider. And from there, look at these bigger questions. Maybe we do need to have public debate about the community standards, and maybe we do need to have a properly funded complaints body, and maybe Facebook ought to be under an obligation to respond to those things rather than they just go off into the ether and there's no accountability for it. And maybe you also get to object if your account is deactivated, and have some way of getting a response to that rather than just allowing the company to decree something. And if you happen to be caught up in that, despite you not fitting the objective, that you should have some recourse. And these are the kinds of questions that I think aren't easy to answer. But I'm hopeful that as we start to have these discussions, that's what will be explored.
Yeah, Dan, I guess it ends up being the fact that we are not just consumers of Facebook, we are also producers for Facebook. And each time that we are active on the site, we are feeding more of our behavioural surplus into their machine to give us more and more of what we want down the future, which is what makes such an amazing platform for advertisers. I'm just interested really briefly, from your perspective, just why does Facebook work so well compared to, putting a billboard on yourself and standing outside the local corner?
Although I would argue it wouldn't necessarily work better than putting a billboard on the Guardian. But I think the fundamental point, though, in all seriousness, is Facebook are an incredibly effective advertising vehicle because they have incredible advertising targeting capabilities, because they collect such a huge volume of data about their users and are able to offer targeting in a ridiculous way. I mean, if I wanted to, I could target 30 to 31-year-olds living in Balmain that have an interest in Mercedes. Like that's how targeted you can get with your advertising on Facebook, as one example. And there's an infinite number of these. So that's the point, is that they are such an effective advertising vehicle because they collect so much data about their consumers. And I think consumers are still pretty much unaware that this is happening by and large.
Yeah. And I don't care if the 3 people in Balmain that want to buy a Mercedes are the ones that are targeted. I care when it's using political content to push people down particular paths. And I think that's where at least this boycott is building a bit of an awareness of where that can go. And, the other bit that we haven't spoken about is their resistance to truth and political advertising on the way that they run their political ads. And that's a piece of work that is, really urgently needed to put some sort of civic ethos around that.
I would say, though, Peter, that they are related. Like the political dynamic that we see on Facebook is related to the business model, because like you say, Dan, their whole business model is drawing out more information from you so that you will be served up as a perfect audience for a particular advertiser. And that requires that you stay on the platform, and that requires that you continue to hand over that data. So they're designed around a form of addiction, I think. There's a lot of similarities with how they design electronic gambling machines. This idea of a never-ending news feed, you can always scroll and find something else that will give you a dopamine hit. That kind of project is intimately linked to their business model of providing audiences for advertisers, and it therefore inevitably influences how we engage with public life. You end up seeing things you want to see. You're pushed into a narrow way of thinking, of engaging, and politically that happens as well. So you end up seeing a totally different internet to what your neighbours might see. And that invariably does break down our capacity to have discussions about common issues and themes. Like it's the model of the business does, I think, come into conflict with the idea of a democratic society. And that's something I think we do need to contend with on a big level, as well as in these more everyday debates.
I think we're having a great discussion amongst ourselves. I want to bring a bit of the room into this before we move on. So Mark Gibson, who's a great friend of the Centre from Monash Uni, made a really good comment about the network effect. Are you there, Mark?
Hi, Peter. Yes, I'm actually now at RMIT.
That's right. My apologies.
That's all right. I was just I was making a point in response to some of the comments about why don't people just choose alternative networks. I think the problem with that is that companies like Facebook have massive network effects. It's like the phone network. You want to be on the network that has the most people there, and it has the more there are, the greater the potential value in being a member of the network. So I think there is a kind of natural monopoly of networks in that way, so that it's very hard to set up alternatives. The only one that I can think of, and I've discussed this with other people, is the possibility of public broadcasters setting up alternative networks. I don't know if people have comments on that, whether the ABC has the grunt to be able to set up some kind of network that might be sufficiently large.
Yeah, I reckon that's a fascinating point, and one probably for a whole other tech talk, which is ABC is still basically a one-way communication point, the broadcast. Imagine if the ABC was a genuine network, it would end up looking like the sort of social network that could provide what Facebook is providing at the moment without the surveillance capitalism.
Yeah.
But another point on this as well, by the way, is that it's not just, I mean, obviously I agree with everything with regards to the network effect, but I've heard so many people say I'm boycotting Facebook or I'm getting off Facebook, but continuing to use Instagram and WhatsApp. And I suspect that most people on this call, if not everyone, knows that those apps are owned by Facebook, but I would still contend that the vast majority of the population still doesn't. So even getting away from some of the very strong network effects that might exist on one platform, such as Facebook, typically consumers are still using the others, and therefore they're still in a tremendously powerful position.
Which moves us on to mergers and acquisitions, which was the next thing I wanted to kick around a bit. So
you're welcome.
At the moment, Google is in the process of taking over Fitbit. So we've got a search engine that wants to take over a company that puts this wearable technology, which kind of at first instance seems a bit weird, and still you start thinking that the only game in town is collecting data. So, what is the long play for Google taking over Fitbit, Dan? And, as an advertiser, what sort of new toys will they be able to offer if this goes through?
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, this is straight out of the surveillance capitalist playbook. I mean, I think that they have bought Fitbit entirely for the consumer data that comes with it. I was trying to get a good sense of how many users they have for Fitbit on Fitbit, and there's a range, but I think as a minimum, there's 40 to 50 million monthly active users that Fitbit has, and the information that they are collecting on their consumers is remarkable. I mean, it is beyond personal information. It's health information. It's how people are sleeping. It's exactly their location. I think all of this.
How many steps a day? Yeah.
Exactly, and I think all of this data just feeds into the data machine that Google has created, which gives them an incredibly accurate view on consumers, often more accurate than they have on themselves, which again can be used for targeted advertising purposes. And that's both a commercial problem, but as you've identified previously as well, it's also potentially a democratic problem if that targeting is exploited.
So you put your Fitbit on, and it's everything you do automatically goes back to the mothership, or do you click one of those consent forms for that to happen?
Actually, I'm probably the wrong person to ask, because I don't have one, because I have a natural aversion to this because of this conversation. But I think so. That is my understanding. I mean, Lizzie, you might have a better view.
How many steps a day do you do, Lizzie?
A lot, but I never tell Fitbit how many I'm doing. So I don't tell Fitbit either. Well, the other context to this is that Google's also recently entered into a partnership with a health insurance provider in the United States. So they're now gathering health data from 2,600 hospitals in the US. So health data is clearly one of their strategic objectives to gain access to it. That's how they want to diversify their business, I think, over the long term. And there has been whistleblowers talking about this. It's called Project Nightingale. There's been staff members at Google who resigned over it because they were deeply troubled by it. So they're clearly trying to gather more health information. And the thing I'd point out is a lot of times when it's discussed, they say, oh, it's compliant with the various regulations because we don't share people's name associated with the data. And I just don't think that's a defense that's anywhere good enough. There's huge amounts that you can learn about people, even at an individual level, because I fit a particular demographic. Even if I've shared nothing with Fitbit, Google will then know that I'm interested in certain kinds of advertising, or it can predict and encourage me to be interested in certain kinds of products just because of other demographic qualities they know about me, even when I've never shared anything via a Fitbit. So what these large data sets allow these companies to do is push them through their very sophisticated machine learning systems and compile them with other data sets that they've gathered themselves, and learn just huge amounts about how people might be interested in being groomed as consumers and being advertised to. And that's my big concern. I don't think we should ever assume that just because you rip someone's name off a bit of data or a set of data, that's somehow some form of protection. It absolutely isn't.
I would have also thought if you're entering into the insurance game and they're also talking about diagnostics, that, you know, you will be in a world where your Fitbit will determine what sort of premium you're paying. Like if you are keeping yourself fit and healthy, you're going to be paying less. Now, that creates a can of worms, doesn't it, in terms of the interaction between the user and, you know, the businesses that underwrite our health system.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, the other thing that I think about as a woman is it probably helps them predict when you might be joining a health insurer, for example, because you're thinking about having children. Like, I'm pretty sure that even though I don't have a Fitbit, I'm the only one that gets like advertising for like period underwear on this panel, unlike you two, because they know that what I might be potentially interested in buying. So it's not even just like kind of your long-term health. It might be your health at that particular point in time. And there's all sorts of ways in which they could bake in discrimination as applies to certain segments of the population that you would just have no way of detecting, which I think is, yeah, hugely problematic.
Well, and in the chat, Mark Andreevich pointing out that insurance companies are already using Fitbit to adjust premiums in the US. And Lucy pointing out that, you know, there was a case a while ago, it's running up, where fitness trackers revealed locations of state government military bases. Because the data was public, you could view maps where people were exercising.
I would say that about Mark. You're absolutely right, Mark. And in fact, there was a scheme in the US. I mean, obviously the health insurance system is different, but where you can get a discount on premiums if you got a Fitbit. So of course it's incentivizing people to do that. And then you can be essentially starting to be locked out of certain insurance products, which are obviously essential to accessing basic care in the US, unless you do subscribe to one of these programs. And it's just, particularly when insurance is bartered through your employer, that your employer may be entering into an arrangement with an insurer that requires you to do this. You don't want to do it. You might be left with very few options for how you can access health insurance. So it's, yeah, extremely troubling.
It's also just a quick observation. This is also happening on car insurance, for example. There's a lot of the insurers are starting to experiment with downloading an app to your phone, and they track your driving habits. And if you're deemed to drive safely, you get a discount on your premiums. I mean, this impacts on everything, including health.
So using your dark arts hats as someone that understands targeted advertising, Dan, where else can this go? Like this said, like what does Google then offer you at The Guardian?
That's a big question, Peter. Perhaps, can I take a step back? And just, yeah, this is sort of almost a philosophical one. I mean, I think the problem that we have here is because the internet, or at least the two biggest players on the internet, are built off advertising. So we're not having this conversation about Apple, right? There's other competition concerns about Apple, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying they're immune from criticism. But I just make the point that Apple are also in the position where they are collecting a tremendous amount of consumer data, or could be. The difference is they're not making use of it for the purposes of targeted advertising. So I'm quite comfortable wearing an Apple Watch, for example, in a way that I would never be comfortable wearing a Fitbit. I think one way, perhaps the horse has bolted, in fact, I suspect it has, but one way of fixing the internet, without wanting to sound or get too carried away, is that if it wasn't built on advertising, if it was built on, you know, paying for access or some kind of subscriptions, this problem is certainly minimised to a substantial extent. Don't know if that answers your question, Peter.
But, you know, it also, I think back 20 years to, you know, the early days where people had ideas of, you know, a very small email payment fee to actually create a business model of users, but that got ruled out at the entry point. And I think we've just got so used to free access to the things we want online that it's such a big shift now, isn't it? You know, and so, you know, these platforms needed to find a way to make a buck, and, you know, they have.
And they certainly found a very effective way, right? I mean, I think just coming back to your question, which I think will probably get us to the next point, is if you think about where this could go. So facial recognition is now something which is starting to become incredibly prominent. I am by no means an expert, Lizzie, I think you are, so I might defer to you on this. But if you just, my observation is, or my guess is, once you start applying facial recognition, you're able to track people in the real world, and then the targeting capabilities of advertising then and the invasions of privacy then go beyond anything we're already seeing.
Key role to Digital Rights Watch's latest campaign, Lizzie.
Yeah, it's thanks for that segue, Dan. I appreciate you. You're in charge of getting.
I think you're hosting now. I'm just going to sit back. This is great.
Yeah, so we Yeah, we at Digital Rights Watch are very worried about facial recognition technology. In part, that's because it is largely evolving and being developed in a lawless space, in essence. But for the reasons that you described, Dan, I think one of the frontiers of advertising in digital settings will be connecting people's real-world experience, their corporal experience, with their online one, and being able to use facial recognition technology for that purpose is the obvious way in which that can be achieved. And that's something that digital advertisers have been doing for a long time, trying to link these things up. You know, there's all sorts of technology that allows devices to talk to each other. So, you know, your TV might be listening to what you're looking at on your phone, and all sorts of ways in which your laptop might be talking to your phone as well. So already advertisers have been experimenting with connecting up the dots of your real world experience, and facial recognition technology is the key way in which they do it. So already companies are starting to note that people are troubled by this technology. There's been a couple of big name brands who have said they're not going to continue selling or developing the product or selling it to law enforcement, which I think is a good thing. That really was one of the products of the Black Lives Matter movement recently, which I think is a great credit to that movement. But in Australia, at least, there has been talk around a potential moratorium. So the Australian Human Rights Commission recently released a discussion paper on tech and human rights, and this is one of the things that they talk about, that you shouldn't be using facial recognition technology if it's making a decision that has legal implications for the individual, that they're essentially calling for a moratorium, which I think is the sensible thing to be doing at this point. And we endorse that, and we're running a campaign that we should have a moratorium on facial recognition technology. We think that the lawlessness of the space is a big problem. And more generally, I mean, we're concerned about this technology full stop. This is not like you might buy a phone and it can track you. You could throw away the phone, or you could leave it at home if you have to do something that you may not want to be detected while you're doing. Say you're a journalist, or say you've got something private that you want to do. You can always separate yourself from your devices, but your face is totally different. Once somebody has access to that and has plotted it out within their scheme of data, you can't change your face. And this has very permanent implications for how we might be able to move through the world. So we think there's a lot of reasons why a moratorium is really important at this time.
And what's interesting, Lizzie, is it's not just about capturing your face. It's about the algorithms that are then used to determine what that means. And I think where Ed Santo's report at the Human Rights Commission is really interesting is his proposition that any automated decision, but particularly with facial recognition, has to then, the logic of the algorithms needs to comply with discrimination law. So it can't capture a face of colour and therefore place in assumptions into the way that that face is interpreted in the big data set. And I know there's that Australian company, Clearview, that's got into all sorts of trouble just by thinking, oh, we can just, you know, get a huge bank of faces and then sell it to users to make with it what they can. But it feels like our face is a bit sacrosanct here, yeah?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think there's a couple of issues there. That's the algorithm that you might use to determine whether who is the person to detect the actual face. And then there's the data set. Like the FBI has an enormous data set of faces that it uses for its facial recognition program. And there's concerns about that because the people that they tend to have in there are people who are already over-policed. So you can imagine how it can be discriminatory in that way. But then there's a separate question, like why is it okay that Clearview appears to have scraped all its faces off Facebook? You know, this is information that was shared with no intention for that material to be put into a facial recognition database for a company to profit from doing so. This is quite clearly, even though it's not regulated, I think most people would object to that and consider it to be a violation, to consider it to be deeply problematic, and that it shouldn't be allowed. And so that kind of business model just seems unethical. Maybe our laws haven't caught up, but I think most people would agree that it's something that needs to be regulated and stopped. So there's issues around how the discrimination might play out, of course, and this is not just an algorithm issue, it's also a data collection issue, and we need to probably think about it in those terms.
So Dan, if you're one of the big data-driven platforms like a Facebook or a Google, are you interested in this facial recognition technology as well, and how would you be using it?
Yeah, without question. You know, and this involves a fair amount of speculation, but if you look at the historical patterns of both Google and Facebook, it's been, and Fitbit acquisition is the latest example of this, it's been a constant kind of accumulation, acquisition of consumer data because of the lawlessness of this space. To your point, Lizzie, this is an unregulated environment. You can basically collect whatever data you want. This is just, in my view, an extension of what has already happened before. The technology now enables us to capture facial recognition. That seems to be like a fairly substantial step change in what will be targeting capabilities, advertising targeting capabilities. And so why wouldn't you do that? I mean, if you've done that for 20 years and then this technology is available to you to make your targeting even more effective, and it's an unregulated environment, why wouldn't you do it? I can't think of a reason.
Yeah. I might call Mark Andreevich into the conversation if he's here. Mark's part of the Centre for Responsible Technologies Universe and one of the leading experts in digital media, not just in Australia, but in the world. Are you there, Mark?
Thanks, Peter. Hi.
Hi, guys.
Good to talk to you. Yeah.
You know, what's your reflection on like, you know, in a way, we've done a journey today talking first about Facebook's existing business model, moving into Google, getting our health information, our movement information, and then the ubiquity of facial recognition technology. It feels like it's a bit of an opposite to a slippery slope, but something that's moving up into bigger bits of ourselves being rendered.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point about facial recognition is interesting for a couple of reasons. One is obviously, as you pointed out, the face is, there are certain sensitivities around the face. The other is we're used to reading all kinds of information off the face, not just identification. So they're developing technologies that use facial recognition technology accompanied with smart camera algorithms to do things like infer mood, infer attentiveness among students. So the goal is to read a whole range of different forms of information that are otherwise inaccessible. But the other reason I think facial recognition technology comes to be a kind of paradigm for this type of monitoring is a little bit what Lizzie was saying, is kind of taking the forms of monitoring that have characterized the online world and then embedding them in the offline world by making that world smart in the sense that it can passively collect information about us as we go through it and do things. So all the forms of tracking that we've come to associate with online life, we go to a web page, they know where we've been, now can be layered onto off-world life. We go to a store, the cameras know that we've gone there. So this kind of...
It's in the loop.
Yeah, it's kind of making the online world more like the offline world, which gives whole new categories of data and information that can be folded into these logics. I mean, the big concern, just to return us to some stuff that was going on earlier, I think my big concern at this point is what it does to democratic life, right? So, you know, we can think about advertising and we know some of those arguments about how advertising works. Oh, well, wouldn't you rather hear information about products you're interested in? We know that then slips into forms of manipulation. You know, once you know detailed information about people, you can use systems to influence them. That gets a little bit more draconian. But I think for us, like, look at this moment with what's happening. You know, I'm American, so I look at what's happening in the US, and it just looks like complete communication breakdown in terms of being able to have the meaningful type of discussion that is needed to govern a society. And I think these logics that we're talking about that individualize, that break down conditions for democratic discourse kind of contribute to that democratic breakdown.
Thanks for that. And now you've offered a perfect segue into the final topic that we were going to start leading off with, Dan, which is, you know, the future of traditional media. And it's been interesting, hasn't it, through this lockdown, how deficient the social media has been at creating a central point of truth when people really want to know what's going on and what they need to do. Our friends at the QUT have done some amazing work tracking conspiracy theories on the platforms Twitter and Facebook, and they've got more work coming in the wings. At the same time as people have gone back to traditional media as a source of authoritative fact-based news, even as their business models are collapsing. And this kind of all comes together with the ongoing negotiations that stands up to his neck in between the platforms and the news outlets over how much money the platform should be paying for the right to distribute news that's made with real journalism. This has kind of been going on under the surface, and it sort of was first risen with an ACCC platforms inquiry at the end of last year. But it's been happening through the lockdown, Dan, hasn't it? Maybe you can give us a bit of an update on where that's up to and whether you've got any optimism that, you know, there might be a little bit of a recalibration between the balance of power between the platforms and the media the media, traditional media companies?
Sure. I mean, I do have optimism. And just coming back to your first point before I get to the ACCC and the platforms themselves, I mean, that has been one of the real silver linings of these last few months, is that people have remembered the value of traditional fact-based journalism, whether that's from The Guardian or the Sydney Morning Herald or even the News Corp titles. I mean, at least there's been a flocking back of people back to traditional media because there was just so much rubbish being distributed across social. And that's hopefully, my hope is that we're going to see a whole bunch of people remember why news media is important when we come out the other side of this. I mean, for The Guardian, we reached 11.5 million people at the height of this back in March, which is half the population. That's something we would never have been able to have achieved before. So that is a silver lining on this, if you like. I think
even as your advertising revenue collapsed, as you were telling me at the time.
That was the downside, right? So we've got a bigger audience than ever. And unfortunately, every phone call we're getting is from an advertiser wanting to cancel because obviously we're heading into a pretty substantial recession. So fortunately at The Guardian, and I think this is also the case with the former Fairfax mastheads, there's actually that's been offset to a large extent by reader support. So long may that continue. So coming back to your question, Peter, look, I think this has been a long process, so I'll do my best to give it a Cliff Notes sort of summary, if you like. But the ACCC conducted this big digital platforms inquiry, did an amazing job of it. I have to admit, I was quite sceptical when this started of how successful it would be, but the final report that came out, I think Rod Sims did an incredible job and his team did an incredible job of identifying the issue. And I am optimistic that we're going to see change now. So we're now in the process off the back of that report with the ACCC coming up with a code of conduct to govern the relationship between the platforms and digital publishers such as The Guardian. And I'm optimistic that we're going to see some kind of value exchange, fair value exchange between them. So just a couple of points on this. So what effectively our position is, and I think what most publishers' position is that, as I said at the start of this session, almost everybody starts their internet session on one of the platforms, either on Facebook or Google. So they have an audience of about 20 million each, give or take, so pretty much everybody. That makes them unavoidable trading partners for us, and so we have to publish our content both to Google and Facebook. If we don't have a business really. However, there are two substantial benefits that the platforms receive, so Google and Facebook receive, from publishers that they do not pay for. Firstly, our content provides the very engagement that enables them to run their targeted advertising businesses. And secondly, they collect a huge amount of consumer data that they do not pay for from publishers as well. So on the engagement piece, I'll wrap this up in a second, but on the engagement piece, if you take Facebook, for example, they have said that about 4% to 5% of the newsfeed engagement comes from publisher content. So that's 4 to 5% of engagement and potentially revenue that they make off engagement from publisher content that they do not pay for. So that's unfair in our view. In Google's situation, it's slightly different. They don't tend to monetize search queries, but they send content through to publisher websites, which are then monetized using Google's advertising technology. And I think a lot of people don't know that, potentially a lot of people on this call don't know that, but pretty much every publisher in this country and indeed the world uses Google's advertising technology to monetize that traffic, and they take a cut of it. So we think that's an unfair value exchange. And the second point to wrap this up is both of them collect a huge amount of consumer data from publisher content that empowers their advertising business, and they don't pay anything to the publishers for that. And we think that's unfair, and that's what the ACCC is trying to rectify.
So there's an open debate about the value of that news. I think Google estimated it to be about worth 10 million a year. Peter Costello, who's chair of Nine, and a guy who knows a little bit about numbers, reckons it's about 600 million. So there's a fair way between those two numbers. But even something that was in the hundreds of millions would fund a lot of the journalism that's disappeared over the last decade, wouldn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you think about it. $1 million is 10 journalists, right? So give or take. So if we can get, 100 million or 200 million even, I think probably ambitious to think we're going to get 600 million, as Costello has been calling for, but even if it's half that, I mean, that's pretty much restoring the news media to the health that it was prior to the great disruption that the internet brought to publisher businesses. So, I mean, it's a substantial thing that I think anyone who's interested in public interest journalism and the news media in general should be supportive of.
And the one thing that makes you think something could move is it's actually also in News Limited's interest to have this happen, and they're not without influence over the federal government. So at the moment, they're almost at the point where they're saying do a deal or we're going to impose a deal, aren't they?
Exactly, yeah. So it's a mandatory code of conduct, the draft of which is going to be published at the end of this month. And yeah, I think this is the first time that News Corp and The Guardian have been in complete alignment that we need this to happen.
What's your perspective on this, Lizzie?
I mean, look, I agree that a platform like Google is far too profitable, and it comes in and plunders traditional ways of doing things without consequence. It offshores its profits, so it doesn't pay tax that you might normally expect from a very profitable company. I am a bit concerned, you sort of said it, I thought, very well before actually, Dan, which is like when you look at business models that are reliant on advertising, they do tend to be more problematic in the digital age as things have moved on. And I do think eventually we're going to have to figure out how to have a free press that isn't funded by advertising, by collecting data about its readers. And I wonder whether this kind of process will solve a problem in the short term, but leave some of these problems that are larger intact. Like I do think legacy media, I don't know if that's a derogatory term, I don't mean it in that way, but say original print publications, they were certain kinds of gatekeepers of information for the public. And in many ways, the internet brought about a revolution in how that was thought of, in good ways too, by allowing other people to comment on this, to be able to criticize it. And they're requiring then traditional mastheads to be more responsive to public's concerns about these kinds of issues. And, we recently saw a New York Times opinion editor have to resign, basically off the back of a controversial op-ed that he published about sending in troops to deal with Black Lives Matter's protesters. And I think there's a real question there around how do we make sure the media that we want is the media that we get, and could we think bigger than just say reorganising how advertising revenue is distributed between publications and platforms that might feed readers into those publications. And for my money, I think we're going to have to think about funding public interest journalism independent of advertising as the source of revenue that does it. And that's what I would like to see imagined a bit more at this point.
Yeah, it's an interesting point whether the money goes straight into Murdoch's pocket and Dan's pocket, a little bit less probably for Dan, or whether there's other models that there is a fund. Like I think one of the interesting ideas that's starting to get some currency is with the collapse of regional journalism, whether there is a public interest in civic accountability and ensuring that every community has something that has an independent media presence, whether it's online, whether it's a fixed bit of paper, whether it's a radio station. The ABC plays a role, but what is the role for the broader media there? And, also not just thinking about the old ways of news out, but also being truly reflective and able to respond back and hold a mirror up to society, because without that, we are just all consumers on a social media platform, occasionally jumping off for a Zoom. So, is that still in the air too, Dan, the vehicle for that money to be redistributed? Because that sort of money could be transformative, couldn't it?
It could. I mean, look, a couple of points. I mean, Lizzie, broadly, I agree with you, right? I mean, I think the core problem here, to put it simply, is digital advertising is broken. I mean, it is so flawed that I don't think we're never going to solve it, to a substantial point where we're not talking about this constantly. So the way that I think is already happening that we're dealing with this is via readers either taking subscriptions or making contributions in the case of The Guardian. And that trend is continuing, and probably it's starting to be very successful as well. I mean, this is the first time in my career that I felt genuinely optimistic about the media's future. I wouldn't have said that even as little as 3 years ago. Whereas now you can see there's an acceptance from the public that if they like news journalism, they have to pay for it. So I think it's happening to a certain extent already. I guess the point is, I'll get to your question in a second, Peter. The point is, as long as the digital advertising world exists, it's unfair, and therefore we deserve our fair share of it. So that's the point. So coming back to your question, Peter, I mean, yeah, I can see theoretically the appeal of having, some kind of fund or some kind of model where every consumer in Australia has to pay to contribute to it. We are really concerned, we've talked about this a lot at The Guardian, we are really concerned about how that is then distributed, who makes the decisions around how that is distributed. We think there are probably more problems with that than are able to be solved. And so
from sports rorts to news rorts.
What's that, sorry?
From sports rorts to news rorts.
Well, exactly right. And it creates other problems as well, right? Because then who's distributing the money? Do you have accountability of those? Because, it's not a news organisation's interest to critique that organisation, whatever it is that's distributing the money. I mean, don't get me wrong, we're a big supporter of the ABC and its continued funding of that. But I just think if the entire media industry was determined by that, I think we would probably create a whole number of unintended consequences. I think the best thing to do is try and make advertising work better and redistribute the funds from the platforms more fairly in the meantime. But at the same time, keep pursuing trying to grow our reader revenue, our subscriptions, our contributions, because that will ultimately make us more independent and more successful in the long term, I think.
Right. We've got a couple of minutes to run down the clock. We haven't even really talked about the other, big issue, which is TikTok, and it probably needs a whole hour discussion for that, but that's what my kids are on. And apparently it's a window for the Chinese government into our kids' lounge rooms at the moment. And whether or not that's, do you want to quickly just give a couple of minutes, each of you reflecting on where that debate's going, and that might sort of frame things up to sort of prepare for the chat in a month's time.
Oh, well, maybe I'll start. One of
Yeah.
the campaigners from Digital Rights Watch, Sam Floriani, she's published a piece on Dan's website on The Guardian talking about TikTok. And I think some of the concerns about TikTok, Donald Trump's talking about banning it because there's this argument that the data goes straight to the Chinese Communist Party.
And they bugger up his rallies.
Yeah, and they bugger off his rallies. So, I do think that's kind of the reason why people get concerned about this platform, or why, proximity to this kind of political embarrassment has been the driver of that, rather than a genuine concern for people's privacy. Because obviously, Donald Trump himself is a big user of other social media platforms and doesn't seem too concerned about how they share users' information. And I guess sometimes I get a bit concerned that these discussions around how terrible China is in contrast to liberal democracies can be a bit skewed. Like I'm not trying to draw an equivalence here, because I think totalitarianism and authoritarianism in China is an enormous problem, and that violates lots of people's rights. But I think we can also sometimes target platforms like TikTok without realizing that the business model is very similar for lots of other social media platforms, and that, we need to have a discussion like that in our own backyard before we start complaining about TikTok being something that is a front for the Chinese Communist Party. It's not clear that it's that much worse than what some other companies do here in Australia, and obviously those headquartered in the US. So I'm all for having a discussion about why companies shouldn't be just sharing users' information willy-nilly, but let's talk about all of the offenders and let's come up with a better regime for doing it, rather than just allowing Donald Trump to make a political point as a bellwether friend when it comes to the issue of privacy.
Great. And Daniel?
Look, similar views. I guess I am more concerned about TikTok than Google and Facebook. I think they're collecting a whole bunch of, very similar information to what Google and Facebook collect on their properties. So I absolutely accept that point. I guess the key difference here is that, Google and Facebook are still domiciled in the US and not in the People's Republic of China. And therefore, the government can't just go and take that data in a way which is theoretically possible. I'm not saying it happens with TikTok, but it is at least theoretically possible with TikTok. So I have probably bigger concerns. But I think ultimately, Lizzie, what I think we need on this is more transparency from all of these companies, right? This is the problem. Whether it's Google, Facebook, TikTok, Twitter, whoever, it is completely opaque what data is collected and what they do with it. And ultimately, regulation is required, I think, to require a greater level of transparency from all of these. And it probably mitigates a lot of these problems if we get that. And that's I think, where we need to focus.
Excellent, guys. We're at the hour. Look, if nothing else, I hope this has illustrated to people that have joined us how rich and diverse the discussion around tech is. I like to think this is the really good red wine of politics. Like, it takes a little bit of, getting used to get a sense of what is really good. But once you're in there, it's fascinating, and it goes into politics, it goes into personal freedoms, it goes into business, it goes into the media, and it goes into the sort of society that we're creating in real time. So, Lizzie and Dan, thanks for being part of it. Thanks for everyone that was involved in the chat. We'll send out a follow-up email. If people have got particular topics they'd like covered in this, let us know. but you know, these issues are moving so fast, as is everything else, that, you know, just having a little bit of a moment every now and then to reflect on them, at least for me, is a really good use of an hour's time. So thanks everyone for being part of it today. Stay in touch. We'll post this on the internet. If you know anyone that might be interested, flick them the link, and stay well and happy. I think next week we're doing an Australia at Home briefing on Tuesday about framing climate change. I'm actually having my first week off since the lockdown, so I won't be around, but my colleagues, Peter Stahl and Tony Douglas, will be running that event. And then we've still got, you know, a couple of things happening each and every week. So stay part of the family and look after yourselves, all of you. Cheers.